Think about all the work that your muscle does every day. All of these movements look completely different, but behind every single one is the same remarkable biological machinery, your skeletal muscles. And here's the interesting part. Every skeletal muscle cell has a set of fundamental properties that allows it to sense, respond, generate force, stretch, and also return to its original shape. In other words, skeletal muscle has its own superpowers. And there are four fundamental ones that you need to know: excitability, contractility, extensibility, and elasticity. Let's start with excitability, basically, the ability to respond. Imagine this: you place your hand on a hot pan. Almost instantly, you pull your hand away. You don't stop to think. The movement happens almost automatically. But how does your muscle know that it needs to act? This begins with excitability. Excitability is the ability of a muscle cell to respond to an appropriate stimulus by generating an electrical change in its membrane. And the process begins outside the muscle. Your sensory receptors detect the heat first. That information is converted into electrical signals and travel through a sensory neuron towards spinal cord. Inside spinal cord, the information is processed and relayed through a motor neuron. The motor neuron then carries the signal back towards the muscle. And when that signal reaches the neuromuscular junction, something remarkable happens. The motor neuron releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle cell membrane. This changes the electrical state of the membrane and generates an action potential. That electrical signal then travels along the muscle fiber and deep into the muscles through the T tubules. And this is where one superpower leads directly into the next. Because the muscle has now been already excited, it's ready to contract. Now imagine you are carrying two heavy grocery bags. You grip the handles, your elbow flexors activate, and suddenly your muscles are producing enough force to keep those bags from pulling your arm towards the floor. That's contractility. Contractility is basically the ability of the muscle tissue to develop tension and generate force in response to stimulation. But how does a muscle cell actually do this? For that, we need to zoom in. Inside the muscle fiber are thousands of tiny functional units called sarcomeres. And the sarcomere is where the real action happens. It contains two contractile proteins, actin and myosin. When the muscle is activated, calcium is released inside the muscle fiber. Calcium binds to troponin, causing tropomyosin to move away from the binding sites on actin. Now, the myosin heads can attach to actin and then they pull. This repeated interaction between actin and myosin causes the thin filaments to slide past the thick filaments. The sarcomere shortens. Millions of sarcomeres shortening together produce tension in the muscles, and that tension can ultimately create movement. So, when you're lifting something heavy, you're not simply using a muscle, you're witnessing millions of microscopic molecular interactions working together to generate force. But there's a problem. Muscles don't only need to shorten, sometimes they need to lengthen as well. And that brings us to our third superpower called extensibility, basically the ability to be stretched. Imagine reaching up to the highest shelf to grab a book. Your shoulder and elbow move. Your muscles change their length to allow the movement. But when some muscles are shortening, others are being lengthened. And this ability to lengthen without being damaged is called extensibility. Extensibility is the ability of a muscle to be stretched or lengthened beyond its resting length. And this property is incredibly important because movement isn't simply about muscles getting shorter. Every movement requires muscles to work across different lengths. And this brings us to one of the most important concepts: the length tension relationship. A muscle does not produce the same amount of force at every length, because the amount of overlap between actin and myosin changes as the sarcomere length changes. If the sarcomere is too short, the filaments don't interact optimally. If it's stretched too far, there's not enough overlap between actin and myosin to form enough cross bridges. But somewhere in between, the overlap is just right. And that's where the muscle can produce its greatest active tension. So, extensibility isn't simply a muscle can stretch, it's about allowing the muscle to operate across a range of lengths while maintaining its ability to produce force. And now we have one final question. After a muscle stretches, what happens when the stretch is removed? And that is where the fourth superpower comes in: the elasticity, the ability to return to its original length. Picture someone throwing a ball. The muscle and the tissues involved in the movement are stretched and loaded, and then the release. This brings us to elasticity, the ability of a muscle or its components to return towards their original length after being stretched or deformed once the stretching force is removed. Think of your muscle like a rubber band. Stretch it, release it. It recoils. Your muscle is not a rubber band, of course, but it does contain elastic components that allows it to store and release mechanical energy. And even within the sarcomere, the structural proteins contribute to its elastic behavior. One particularly important protein is titin. Titin acts like a molecular spring within the sarcomere. When the sarcomere is stretched, titin contributes to passive tension and helps the structure return towards its resting configuration. So let's put everything together. Your muscle cells can detect and respond to stimulus, generate tension and force, lengthen when stretched, and also return towards its original length after being stretched. Together, these four properties allow skeletal muscle to do something that looks deceptively simple: move you through the world. Every movement that you perform is the visible result of an incredible amount of microscopic activity. So, the next time you move, remember your muscles aren't just contracting, they are sensing, responding, generating force, stretching, and also recoiling. Four fundamental properties, four superpowers, and one extraordinary muscle cell.